Going Nowhere. Episode 7. Held Down. On this date, at a point in time when the fields of this area could roll in waves with a summer breeze, 4 strangers appeared on the crest of the unknown. One, an oxymoron of a man, pious and unbelievably selfish. Standing next to him, a clever whip of a con woman. Then there was the man that blades of grass parted upon his footfall, or so they say in the legends made about him. He and the man stood beside him, fixed with a permanent scowl, held a fire within their chests, and soon it would burn a permanent mark into their new home. They took up residence here, in this new unknown, with the settlers that had already found a patch of empty to survive in. But rather than be a place they simply lived, the trees, the land, everything became theirs. In their mind, why wouldn't it be? This was their home, after all, and their home needed work. So it soon became their job to fix it. 7 months later, the pious egotist and the con woman lay at the low of their lovely, lovely home, having known no peace in their demise. In the following years, their home would be usurped and rebuilt under the guise of betterment, in such a way that would make their stomachs churn their empty contents while buried 6 feet under. A decade later, everything, well, nearly everything would burn to the ground, along with the flame that set it all ablaze. So happy birthday, dumbass town. As Nowhere celebrates its sesquicentennial, let's take a rose-colored look at this town's founding and the mysterious deaths of the Grayson family. Because nothing in this town could happen without someone dying. First, I'd like to paint a portrait of the family. The father was Clarence Grayson. His name, loosely stemming from the word for bright in Latin, seemed to usher in light, an ever-burning torch to come to this patch of land. His wife, Josephine, was a meticulous planner, the brains to Clarence's charisma, and took an active part in organizing the lawlessness of this new Indiana. Arthur was their golden son. He had the smile of his father, the sense of his mother, and worked alongside both in efforts to build up Nowhere from the few homesteads that originally dotted the flat earth. Then, there was Matthew. It wasn't that he was ever treated as lesser than his brother or ever ostracized at all. He seemed to take a special pleasure in his part-time job as Arthur's shadow, and was in nearly every way just like his brother. We know their quaint stories. Clarence came to the area on horseback, bearing the uncertain knowledge that this may or may not, in fact, be the land he had spent 7 years working to pay for, with a wife and 2 children. Matthew had been bucked from his horse, earning him a broken leg that risked a worsening condition if they could not find somewhere to rest before the winter hit. Their venture had taken them here, to what was assumed to be the land Clarence had bought those many months prior. He and Arthur first built a simple log cabin for shelter to allow Matthew to heal. After the first winter in Nowhere, battling bitter cold with little assistance from the other homesteads, Clarence, Arthur, Josephine, and Matthew began building a brick-and-mortar home, the necessary farming implements to survive, and a community. The untold stories of Nowhere. History of Nowhere, I.N. Frontier, Indiana. Their faces are plastered across these pages, calling them all esteemed citizens. But time has caused the paint to chip and peel away, to reveal what truly lies beneath. While I would love to have written statements from Clarence, Josephine, and the two sons, Clarence mostly kept track of their supplies, Josephine the same except with chores and tracking the calendar, and Matthew had sparse pages, filled with brief, vivid descriptions, but no actual mention of what happened to his family. Arthur Grayson's diary is the most complete account of their first months in nowhere, reading more like a novel than anything else. We begin with this passage, dated a day after their supposed arrival in nowhere. There's sickness here. Father said he could feel it the moment we had locked eyes on the land. Something that hung like smoke, he told my mother, thick with the scent of stale air and wasting. And how do you cure an unknowable plague? My father asked. A spark in his eyes told me he was looking for a very specific answer. You must make them aware that they are sick in the first place, I told my father, and Matthew quickly parroted a response. Father clicked his tongue in disapproval. Arthur, my boy, he said to me on this day, if you tell them they are sick, they will panic. Panic brings only chaos and harm to those in denial, and harm to those who only try to cure themselves. No. He continues on to the next page. Honestly, his handwriting gets much harder to read in certain parts of the diary, so some of this is my best guess. If you want to cure the sick of an illness they do not know, you do not tell them they are sick. You must make them afraid of an outside sickness. Any flock such as them will fear anything outside their known. Places like these, they're all the same, Arthur. If you are in their circle of what they know, you are kin. You are safe and a comfort, even if you have not the least bit of intentions towards good. Anyone that is not one of their own is a threat to their family. That, my boy, is when they will stay home and cut off the sickness from spreading. When they fear invasion, they circle their wagons and tend to their own. And then your work is practically done for you. He turned his gaze back to our home, and I waited for him to speak again. Son, he said, we don't come from much. My father did nothing for this world besides waste every breath he was given. And my mother let him. Made excuses, made him think he didn't have to do anything, because she would always be there to fix his messes. Your mother's not like that. She holds me to my word. She makes me an honest man, at least to her. Your father's not like mine either. We are outsiders right now, but we will make a community here. We will prove that we are worth their time, their effort, their attention. Arthur, I am going to fix nowhere. And when I die, it will be up to you and your brother to take up the task. No, not only must you take up the task, you must improve. We must be better than the men whose footsteps we walk in. We must learn from their mistakes and build a home on the crumbled, abandoned bricks they left us with. Do you understand? I told him I did. Good. His gaze was still on the spot he spoke so softly, so fondly of when he said the word home. We begin work tomorrow. I find Arthur's writing too distastefully preachy to enjoy it, but what is fascinating is the story's illustrations of their family dynamics. It is up to Matthew and I to do the footing of Father's bill, Today we were out there as he knocked on doors with the smile of Peter himself, checking on neighbors. Father has a routine now, practiced and precise. Shake the man's hand, greet the lady. Remark how grown their eldest is and how wonderful they are young to the smallest. Show immediate concern for whatever ailment they have and offer to have himself, Matthew, I, or all three help out. Almost always they refuse at first. But before they can air their statement, Father interrupts and says, yes, but it is up to the young to do these things, isn't it? And Matthew and I would be pointed towards work, fixing something on the homestead, chopping and stacking lumber, cleaning livestock pens, all while Father talked pleasantries, preaching words of a God he stopped believing in many years ago. And inevitably, they would come to find his presence a comfort. I knew what he was doing. Matthew did too. He and Mother sat at the old wooden table in our kitchen and discussed which houses were struggling when, where, and how to swoop in and be the saviors of the community. It was how they helped. How we paid our penance to all that nowhere gave us. Another entry, later. The first time I had ever seen my father raise his voice at one of us was when I had left Matthew alone for the day when we were kids. He shouted, the first I had ever heard him shout, when we couldn't find Matthew for nearly 2 hours. Little Scamp was fine, of course. He was hiding out in the barn loft, back when the land we worked on wasn't ours, and that mere prank nearly cost us both dinner for the week. When my father raises his voice, it causes inescapable fear. When my mother raises her voice at me, it may be one of the few times I have truly understood the meaning of powerlessness. Her words hit like bullets from the gun of a skilled marksman. All the right spots before you even have the chance to understand what has happened. Sometimes you don't even notice until the pain becomes unbearable, and you realize the wound has begun to fester. I do not think I could ever fear my father the way I truly fear my mother. The feeling of drowning, of being dragged under, holds not the smallest flicker of a candle flame to the dizzying knowledge that you do not matter to our starless sky. One last one, a few months before their parents' funeral. I used to scare Matthew when we were both boys with the story of the vampire hermit. It was an old ghost tale Father told me, in the first place we had ever called home, when he had fewer coins and even fewer lines on his face. A silly story, really, about a skeleton with blood-red eyes that lived in a family's loft, attacking and sucking on the blood of the husband who went to check on his new house. The wife, catching sight of the gruesome scene, flees to the woods with her infant daughter. The vampire hermit hears her attempts to escape, letting out a shriek that rivals the demons of hell, and chases after her. Only after a group of hunters begin pursuit of the monster does it transform into a rabbit and scamper off to find its next victim. Matthew would not look at a rabbit the same until he had well hit 15. We saw one, out in the cornfields that we tend to, scampering about amidst the shoots of corn stalks coming up in late July. I asked him if he still remembered the story of the vampire hermit rabbit, and he chuckled and said he did. He was quiet for a moment, as my brother thinks more than he speaks, continuing to pull weeds. "This is the first time I've seen a rabbit here," he said, looking up at me. "Perhaps they're just not common in this area. Surely you've seen a prairie dog or similar animal." Matthew did not respond to this. His eyes began to unfocus. "They don't tell stories like the vampire hermit here, either." I understood the issue. Dropping my tools, I clasped my brother by the shoulder. "This is new land, Matthew. We are making it anew, creating something from nothing, you understand? We are the authors of stories to be carved into the earth and dance across the lips of our descendants long after we are gone. That is a strange feeling, yes, but do not be ashamed, brother. It is only a new horizon." He smiled, eyes still distant. The expression on his face was one I recognized from the nights where Father reclines with a glass of whiskey after dinner and speaks of the past. "I hope it is all that you claim." I'd always been shocked by how quiet my brother's voice can be. I often dream of raising a family here, taking care of Mother and Father, having my brother by my side. I had not the heart to tell him that this was not a shared dream, and instead nodded before going back to my work. This isn't all that there was to the Grayson family. There is passage upon passage of interesting and incredibly disturbing things about them. The town wasn't originally called Nowhere, you know. Whatever Clarence named the town appears to be lost to time. Wherever it is mentioned, Arthur smudged it out. Perhaps to pay respect to his father's memory after he drowned at the banks of Grayson Lake. Now, there's no way to know for sure what Grayson Lake was like before it was called, well, Grayson Lake. That's the unfortunate downside of history. Once a moment of it is gone, we'll never get to relive it again. But I know what the lake is like now. I've ruined the carpet of Charlie's car enough times with trips down there, squelching through the mud and reeds. They must not be allowed to touch it for maintenance or something. It's a nightmare to visit. Around the shores, the water is green with algae, coating the surface so theoretically nothing could live underneath. The undergrowth on the muddy banks is thick with plants that normally shouldn't grow in Indiana. There's a stench wafting from it, rotting vegetation. When you first begin to wade out, it's readily apparent that you will not be able to see any part of your body that disappears under the water. You wouldn't be able to see anything else in there with you, either. As you move farther out, it becomes more and more uncertain the depths of the water. Some say 2 feet, some say 20 feet. Whatever it is, it's dangerous, and no one I know is stupid enough to test the depths. There have been too many tales of drowned bodies, bloated and floating out on the lake. So I can only imagine what it was like for the Grayson boys to see their parents lying face down in those waters, unmoving. Luckily, I don't have to. The bulrush curled around my mother's throat, around my father's torso, and it was clear that there had been many days before Matthew and I had stumbled upon their fallen forms. The nights had been cold in Nowhere, which made burying the remains all that much easier. Arthur neglects to include in his diary a few key details that Matthew, in the sparse pages he wrote, mentions. For one, there have been clear signs that there had been a struggle, as he mentions his mother's smock crumpled and caked in mud, but largely untouched by the water, and fingers like claws, digging into the mud, holding on like it was a ledge and she would soon drop. Neither mention any extended state of decay, so they likely hadn't been out that long when the boys found them, if any time at all had passed between their murder and when they found them, that is. If their clothes were mostly dry, and the bodies hadn't begun decomposition yet, it's safe to assume that they didn't just go out for a swim. How easy would it have been, I wonder, for Matthew and Arthur to restrain each parent, one boy dodging blows and scrapes as the other one pushed their heads farther into the silt, until the soft bubbles of air escaping from their open mouths ceased to come to the surface. Of course, there's no evidence of this occurring, no probable motivation either. Arthur, at least according to his writing, loved his parents very much. But I suppose that's the issue. Stories told will always be colored by those who tell them to us. The Graysons are an odd bunch. With a family legacy like theirs, it's hard to separate fact from fiction from folklore. As much as they may be manipulative, cunning people, they founded this town. Arthur Grayson ruled atop his throne of righteous civil benevolence for every election he ran in. He hosted the first official election in Nowhere after it was deemed a town. And yes, they did good. They helped people, and the stories of Arthur Grayson and his father mediating the conflict of the early days when Nowhere wasn't quite so suburban are still true. But that's not the entire story. That they aren't saying everything. There's something they aren't telling us. Stay curious, Nowhere. Real quick, I got my first piece of mail. At least that's what I assume this is. Okay, was an envelope left in the station's mailbox addressed to me that says open on air with no return address, so it might just be a good old-fashioned pocket of anthrax. Shall we? Are you thick? Your jokes aren't funny. Your recounting of this town's history is slander towards it, and you aren't covering anything of actual worth. Quit playing at something you know nothing about, or Nowhere may start to get very dangerous for you. Well, I think I have a fan. Going Nowhere is a weekly mystery podcast produced by the Nowhere radio station. Make sure to subscribe to catch the next episode. Rate and review us on iTunes, or leave us a like. Your support genuinely helps. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at @TheNowhereRadio. Visit our Twitter for a link to our Discord community. Thank you. Have a wonderful day.